Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullins. Biographies. Nelson Aldrich (1841–1915). Senator from Rhode Island, head of National Monetary Commission. His daughter Abby Aldrich married John D. Rockefeller Jr. He became the grandfather of his namesake, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, as well as the present David Rockefeller and Lawrence Rockefeller. William Jennings Bryan (1860–1925). Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, 3 times losing presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, in 1896, 1900, and 1908, and head of the Democratic Party. Alfred Owen Crozier (1863–1939). A prominent attorney in Grand Rapids, Cincinnati, and New York, Crozier wrote 8 books on legal and monetary problems, focusing on his opposition to the supplanting of constitutional money by the corporation currency printed by private firms for their profit. Clarence Dillon (1882–1979). Born in San Antonio, Texas, son of Samuel Dillon and Bertha Lapowitz. Harvard, 1905. Married Ann Douglas of Milwaukee. His son, C. Douglas Dillon, later Secretary of the Treasury, 1961–65, was born in Geneva, Switzerland in 1909 while they were abroad. Dillon met William A. Reed, founder of the Wall Street bond broker William A. Reed & Company, through introduction by Harvard classmate William A. Phillips in 1912, and Dillon joined Reed's Chicago office in that year. He moved to New York in 1914. Reed died in 1916, and Dillon bought a majority interest in the firm. During World War I, Bernard Baruch, chairman of the War Industries Board, known as the Tsar of American Industry, asked Dillon to be assistant chairman of the War Industries Board. In 1920, William A. Reed & Company name was changed to Dillon, Reed & Company. Dillon was director of American Foreign Securities Corporation, which he had set up in 1915 to finance the French government's purchases of munitions in the United States. His right-hand man at Dillon Reed, James Forrestal, became Secretary of the Navy, later Secretary of Defense, and died under mysterious circumstances at a federal hospital. In 1957, Fortune magazine listed Dillon as one of the richest men in the United States, with a fortune then estimated to be from $150 to $200 million. Alan Greenspan, 1926. Appointed by President Reagan to succeed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in 1987. Greenspan had succeeded Herbert Stein as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisers in 1974. He was the protege of former chairman of the Board of Governors, Arthur Burns of Austria Bernstein. Burns was a monetarist representing the Rothschilds' Viennese School of Economics, which manifested its influence in England through the Royal Colonial Society, a front for Rothschilds and other English bankers who stashed their profits from the world drug trade in the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. The staff economist for the Royal Colonial Society was Alfred Marshall, inventor of the monetarist theory, who, as head of the Oxford Group, became the patron of Wesley Clare Mitchell, who founded the National Bureau of Economic Research for the Rockefellers in the United States. Mitchell, in turn, became the patron of Arthur Burns and Milton Friedman, whose theories are now the power techniques of Greenspan at the Federal Reserve Board. Greenspan is also the protege of Ayn Rand, a weirdo who interposed her sexual affairs with guttural commands to be selfish. Rand was also the patron of CIA propagandist William Buckley and the National Review. Greenspan was director of major Wall Street firms such as J.P. Morgan Co., Morgan Guaranty Trust, the American Bank for the Soviets after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Brookings Institution, Bowery Savings Bank, the Dreyfus Fund, General Foods, and Time, Inc. Greenspan's most impressive achievement was as chairman of the National Commission on Social Security from 1981 to 1983. He juggled figures to convince the public that Social Security was bankrupt, when in fact it had an enormous surplus. These figures were then used to fasten onto American workers a huge increase in Social Security withholding tax, which invoked David Ricardo's economic dictum of the iron law of wages, that workers could only be paid a subsistence wage, and any funds beyond that must be extorted from them forcibly by tax increases. As a partner of J.P. Morgan Co., since 1977, Greenspan represented the unbroken line of control of the Federal Reserve System by the firms represented at the secret meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910, where Henry P. Davison, right-hand man of J.P. Morgan, was a key figure in the drafting of the Federal Reserve Act. Within days of taking over as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Greenspan immediately raised the interest rate on September 4, 1987, the first such increase in 3 years of general prosperity, and precipitated the stock market crash of October 1987, Black Monday, when the Dow Jones average plunged 508 points. Under Greenspan's direction, the Federal Reserve Board has steadily nudged the United States deeper and deeper into recession, without a word of criticism from the complacent members of Congress. Colonel Edward Mandell House (1858–1938), son of a Rothschild agent in Texas, succeeded in electing 5 consecutive governors of Texas, became Woodrow Wilson's advisor in 1912. Cooperated with Paul Warburg to get the Federal Reserve Act passed by Congress in 1913. Robert Marion Laffolette (1855–1925). Served in Senate from Wisconsin 1905 to 25. Led agrarian reformers in opposing Eastern bankers and their plans for the Federal Reserve Act. Ran for president in 1924 on Progressive Socialist ticket. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Sr. 1860 to 1924. Congressman from Minnesota 1907 to 1917, who led the fight against enactment of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. He served until 1917 when he resigned to run for governor of Minnesota. He ran a good campaign despite adverse newspaper attacks led by the New York Times. His campaign was adversely affected when federal agents burned his books, including Why Is Your Country at War? And the papers and contents of his home office in Little Falls, Minnesota. Louis T. McFadden (1876–1936), Congressman and Chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, 1927–33, courageously opposed the manipulators of the Federal Reserve System in the 1920s and the 1930s. Introduced bills to impeach Federal Reserve Board of Governors and allied officials. After 3 attempts on his life, he died mysteriously. John Pierpont Morgan (1837–1913). Considered the dominant American financier at the turn of the century. Who's Who in 1912 stated he controls over 50,000 miles of railroads in the United States. Organized United States Steel Corporation. Became representative of House of Rothschild through his father, Junius S. Morgan, who had become London partner of George Peabody and Company, later Junius S. Morgan Company, a Rothschild agent. John Pierpont Morgan Jr. succeeded his father as head of the Morgan Empire. David Mullins 1946. Appointed governor of the Federal Reserve Board May 21, 1990, David Mullins' term runs to January 31, 1996. He was recently nominated to serve as vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Domestic Finance 1988–90, receiving the department's highest award, the Alexander Hamilton Award, for his service in such programs as synthetic fuels, federal finance, Farm Credit Assistance Board, and author of the President's Plan for Rescuing the Savings and Loan Institutions. He is a distant cousin of the author, descended from John Mullins, the first recorded settler in the western area of Virginia, hero of the Battle of Kings Mountain, and recipient of a 200-acre grant of land for his service in the American Revolution. Wright Patman (1893–1976), Congressman and Chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee 1963–74. Led the fight in Congress to stop the manipulators of the Federal Reserve System from 1937 to his death in 1976. Congressman Arsène Pujol. Served in Congress 1903 to 1913. Democrat from Louisiana. Chairman of House Banking and Currency Committee. Chairman of Pujol Hearings Subcommittee, 1912. Sir Gordon Richardson 1915. Head of the Bank of England since 1973. Chairman J. Henry Schroeder WAG, London, 1962–72, Director of J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, New York, Schroeder Banking Corporation, New York, Lloyds Bank, London, Rolls-Royce. Jacob Schiff (1847–1920). Born in Rothschild House in Frankfurt, Germany. Emigrated to United States, married Therese Loeb, daughter of Solomon Loeb, founder of Kuhn, Loeb & Co. Schiff became senior partner of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and as representative of Rothschild interests gained control of most of railway mileage in United States. Baron Kurt von Schroeder 1889. Adolf Hitler's personal banker, advanced funds for Hitler's accession to power in Germany in 1933, German representative of the London and New York branches of J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, SS senior group leader, director of all German subsidiaries of ITT, Himmler's Circle of Friends, advisor to board of directors, Deutsche Reichsbank, German Central Bank. Anthony Morton Solomon 1919. Educated at Harvard, Economist Office of Price Administration, 1941–42, Financial Mission to Iran, 1942–46, Agency for International Development South America, 1965–69, President International Investment Corporation for Yugoslavia 196,972, Advisor to Chairman, Ways and Means Committee, House of Representatives, 1972–73, Undersecretary Monetary Affairs, U.S. Treasury, 1977–80, President Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 1980. Samuel Untermyer, 1858–1940. A partner of the law firm of Guggenheimer and Untermyer of New York, who conducted the Peugeot hearings of the House Banking and Currency Committee in 1912. Counsel for Rogers and Rockefeller in many large suits against F. Augustus Heinze, Thomas W. Lawson and others. Earned a single fee of $775,000 for handling merger of Utah Copper Company. Reported in the New York Times May 26, 1924 as urging immediate recognition of Soviet Russia at Carnegie Hall meeting. Untermyer's prestige and power is illustrated by the fact that this front-page obituary in the New York Times covered 6 columns. His listing in Who's Who was the longest for 13 years. Frank Vanderlip, 1864–1937. Assistant Secretary of Treasury 1897–1901, won prestige for financing Spanish-American War by floating $200 million in bonds during his incumbency for what is known as National City Bank's War, President of National City Bank 190,919. One of the original Jekyll Island Group who wrote Federal Reserve Act in November, 1910. No mention of this important fact is made in extensive obituary in the New York Times, June 30, 1937. George Sylvester Viereck, 1884–1962. Author of the definitive study The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, Liverite, 1932. A leading poet of the early 1900s, reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and known as the leading German-American citizen of the United States. Paul Volcker, 1927. Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors since 1979, appointed by President Carter, reappointed by President Reagan for another 4-year term beginning August 6, 1983. Educated at Princeton, Harvard and London School of Economics, employed by Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 1952–57, Chase Manhattan Bank, 1957–61, Treasury Department, 1961–74, President Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 1975–79. Paul Warburg, 1868–1932. Considered to be the actual author of Our Central Bank Plan, the Federal Reserve System, by knowledgeable authorities. Emigrated to the United States from Germany 1904, partner, Kuhn Loeb and Company Bankers, New York, naturalized 1911. Member of the original Federal Reserve Board of Governors, 1914–1918, President Federal Advisory Council, 1918–1928. Brother of Max Warburg, who was head of German Secret Service during World War I and who represented Germany at the Peace Conference, 1918–1919, while Paul was chairman of the Federal Reserve System. Sir William Wiseman, 1885–1962. Partner of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, head of British Secret Service during World War I, worked closely with Colonel House dominating the United States and England.